invite up for our keynote speaker for the evening, who is Storm Cunningham. And Storm is the CEO of reCitizen L3C in Washington, D.C. reCitizen L3C is a new Washington, D.C.-based global network for citizen-led regeneration of communities and natural resources. As an L3C, a cross between nonprofit and for-profit organization, reCitizen will soon provide free, leading-edge online tools for crowdsourcing, crowd mapping, and crowdfunding citizen-led renewal projects and programs. Storm's the author of 2002's The Restoration Economy, which has been hailed by government and business leaders around the world as extraordinary, remarkable, a modern classic, and a landmark work that requires reading. In his second book, reWealth, published in 2008, Storm was described as the world's thought leader on community revitalization and natural resource restoration. And the book was really seen as a secret weapon for economic recovery at both local and global scales. And Storm's third book, reVitalizing, will be published in January of 2013 and will be the first book to document the global rise of citizen-led regeneration. We thought Storm was quite kind of fitting because what we've really been doing around Toronto Pearson the last 4 years is really revitalizing the community and trying to make reinvestments into the community and retrofit this area into an internationally recognized eco-business zone. So we really see his thought patterns and the things he's been describing in his work as a lot of the stuff we're doing here on the ground with all of our partners here. So please join me in welcoming Storm Cunningham.
Hi there. Got a favor to ask of you. For the next 45 minutes or so, if you could avoid blinking, I'd really appreciate it. I've got about a 60-minute presentation here and 45 minutes to do it in. So these slides are going to go past fast and furious, and I'm going to talk like a madman. You ready? Yep. Done. Anybody interested in unlimited economic growth with no social or environmental downsides? All right, you're about to learn how to do it. The key to achieving that is to recognize that all places, whether they're communities or civilizations, start on a base of new development, or what we call these days sprawl. In other words, you start by just building new buildings, new infrastructure, extracting virgin resources. That's how you create a new city. That's how you create a new civilization. There's nothing wrong with that. Nothing evil about sprawl. At the same time you're doing that, in those early days of your city or civilization, you're simultaneously creating a conservation and maintenance economy, maintenance of your built environment and conservation of what's left of your natural environment. But there comes a time when you reach a peak where you can no longer base economic growth just on building new stuff and extracting virgin resources. And when that happens, if you want to continue growing economically, your only choice is to switch into this green area, this top area, restorative development. In other words, renewing the places you've already built and replenishing the natural resources that were damaged along the way. If you do that, there's no limit to how much you can grow economically. I've been doing this full time now for over a decade. You know, I spend my entire professional life in workshops and conferences and meetings on revitalization, redevelopment, remediation, regeneration, all the re-words. And I have yet to hear somebody say, oh my God, we got to slow down this community revitalization program. Our quality of life's going through the roof. You know, we've got way too many jobs. I've never heard anybody say, oh my God, we got to slow down that river restoration program. The water's getting way too clean and it's just way too many fish. Or, oh my God, we got to slow down that brownfields remediation and redevelopment program. We're running out of contaminated property. Yeah, you just don't hear that sort of thing. You can't do too much restorative development. You can't revitalize too much. It's like saying I'm too healthy. You can do it badly. But if you're doing it right, you can't do too much of it. So that's the key to getting unlimited economic growth without the environmental, and you'll see more about the social side of it a bit later. Is there anybody here who has not seen any of these things going on where you live? You know, these are just a few of the species of restorative development that inhabit this restoration economy ecosystem. Now, you've got a passport, a very easy passport to this huge global restoration economy that measures quite literally in the trillions of dollars already. And that simple passport is shifting your prefix from D to re, shifting from development to redevelopment, shifting from degradation and despoilment to remediation, from depletion to replenishment, from demolition to restoration, from degeneration to regeneration, which basically means at that point that you've stopped being a degenerate and started being a regenerate, which basically means we're shifting from a de-economy to a re-economy. That means the asset renewal needs to be the default, the basis of economic growth from here on in. It doesn't mean we never sprawl again, never extract virgin resources again. It just means that needs to become the default, and the sprawl and extraction needs to become the exception. So that was big thing number one. The next big thing number one is that the future of the world's economy is going to have to be based on renewing assets. We've actually got four next big things coming along. Professional speakers are required to tell you about the next big thing. And Chris Rickett told me that this audience was of such a quality, such an intellectual level that you required four next big things. So you're going to get them. My first book, The Restoration Economy, was about that stuff, renewing assets. It was the first time that all of the industries and disciplines and sciences, the project types that were restoring the natural environment and the built environment were brought together and looked at as a discrete global trend, as a discrete economy. Basically, what we're having to recognize now is that everything has a life cycle. Everything has an end to its initial useful life. And in the end, we used to just think of it as trash. And now we're realizing that everything has a reuse in some form. For instance, ships. Hundreds of ships are retired every year. Here's a company whose business it is to clean up old ships and reuse them as fishing reefs. That's what they do for a living. Clean up old ships because there are so many of them. Normally, over the last few decades, when somebody says recycle or reuse, we mostly think of small stuff, bags and bottles and cans and that sort of thing. But what's happening now with the rise of the restoration economy is that we're reusing everything at every size. This is a whole neighborhood of a city comprising nothing but old shipping containers. And it even kind of starts feeding on itself. In Mexico City, the recycling bins are not just made out of recycled plastic, they're actually made out of the bottles themselves. So we're talking about not just reusing and recycling everything, we're talking about transitioning into a time when we're recycling every place, at every scale. You've seen the whole brownfields industry, which didn't even exist 20 years ago. It's now $8 billion a year in the US alone. And landfills are starting to become prime property. Who'd have thunk it? It's just people are fighting over being able to develop on a landfill now because so many of the landfills that used to be out in the sprawl zone, thanks to sprawl, are now in the inner city or inner ring suburbs anyway. So they become prime property because of the location. That map is the northwestern US. It's about an 8-year-old map. Every colored dot on that map is a restoration project. It doesn't include heritage, and infrastructure, brownfields, any of that. These are all just environmental restoration projects. We're surrounded by restoration, and we don't even know it because most government reports don't measure it. All they measure is new stuff and maintenance. They just ignore the end-of-life cycle stuff. Part of the driver behind all this growth is the fact that people are increasingly realizing they'd like to live in the city. We're starting to get back to the European model where the rich live in the middle of the city and the poor live in the suburbs, like in Paris, places like that. That's happening now. According to the last US Census, the majority of growth of poverty was in the suburbs. Very little growth of poverty in the inner cities. So for the last 30 years, the discussion about green and sustainability and environment, conservation, all that has been a fractious one, obviously. Business on one side, the Greens on the other, progressives on one side, conservatives on the other. And that's obviously not a very productive way forward. To have a brighter future, we need to deal with current reality. For instance, as soon as sprawl is created, and obviously the area around the airport here would be considered any environmentalist's epitome of sprawl. It's not livable, but it wasn't meant to be livable. It's light industry. But at the same time, as soon as sprawl is in place, there's nothing that says you can't start greening it. You can't start hydrating it. You can't start adding in the things that might have been left out in the beginning or might not have been needed in the beginning but are needed now in order to pursue the next step. So everything is a restorable asset. As soon as it's created, it becomes a restorable asset. Here's another way of looking at the transition we're in right now. This vertical axis here is increasing wealth or growing economy. Horizontal axis is decreasing resources. So for 5,000 years, we've been on this trajectory here, what I call D-wealth, which is wealth creation that's based on all the D words, you know, development, depletion, all that sort of thing. So for 5,000 years, since we first started creating permanent cities, our economy has been going up on a global basis, but our resource base has been decreasing. We're now at a critical point where contamination on a global basis, constraint, you know, inability to sprawl in many places, and corrosion of our built environment, our buildings and so much of our infrastructure in need of replacement or renovation or redesign, that these crises are forcing us to make a decision. If we stay in the old D-wealth mode, both our economy and our resource base go into long-term decline. If we shift into wealth creation based on redevelopment and replenishment and remediation, you can make just as much money renewing something as you can building it in the first place, more in some cases. Then both our economy and our resource base can go into an upward trajectory. Now, Montana got this message back in 2006. Governor Schweitzer brought me in then to help him launch a statewide restoration economy initiative. And this is a report they published in 2009, which showed that for every $1 million they were putting into environmental restoration in Montana, which is mostly focused on old mines, they got over $2.5 million of related economic activity and generated over 31 higher paying jobs. Oregon, let's see, when was this? June 6th, yesterday. Just got it. And the governor has now announced this Restoration Economy Initiative for rural Oregon. The job creation aspects of restoration are finally starting to get measured by a lot of different organizations. You know, restoration, you know, for instance, if you look at the material from the National Trust for Historic Restoration, they show you that restoring a building generates almost twice as many jobs, and usually higher paying jobs, as building the same size building in the first place. So restoration is a great job creator. Eco-Trust in Portland has got a whole section set up now for measuring restoration-related jobs. United Nations Environmental Program put out this report in, what, 2009, I think, or 2010, talking about the green restoration economy. Massachusetts has announced restoration economy initiatives. Maryland is basing job creation on environmental restoration and using the restoration economy terminology. And 10 years later, all of a sudden, it's taking off. National Oceanographic and Atmospheric Administration. They've got a whole section there on division there on restoration. U.S. Department of Agriculture has announced their future rural initiatives will all be based on creating restoration economies. This is last year. Same year, U.S. Forest Service announced that for the future, their future strategies will all be based on creating forest restoration economies. So it's finally, 10 years of banging my head against walls, it's finally really starting to take off at the institutional level. Walmart's getting into the act. You know, if you can believe it, Walmart's actually getting involved in restoring urban wildlife habitat. Anybody from Walmart here? Guess I should watch my attitude. Nature Conservancy. Long been doing a lot of restoration projects. Now they're actually adopting the restoration economy terminology, like this workshop in Louisiana. Restoration is basically becoming the new conservation. You know, people are realizing that there really isn't any pristine habitat left anymore. There's not a place on Earth that's not poisoned to some degree. There's no ecosystems that don't have some invasive species or that aren't being affected by global climate change to some degree. So it's no longer a matter of these areas need restoration, and these ones are pristine and need conservation. Forget that. That's gone now. Now it's just a matter of how much restoration do they need. After all, a lot of the world looks like this. The reason we're starting to abandon the old, sustainability, green, let's just slow down the rate of damage type argument is because there's so much damage there already. Slowing down the rate of damage isn't the way forward anymore. We've got to start undoing the damage. Because a lot of the world looks like that. Who wants to conserve that? Who wants to sustain that? Or this? It's like, if you ask me, hey, Storm, how's your marriage? And I say, well, it's sustainable. How excited are you going to feel for me? But if I say, oh man, my marriage is revitalizing. Maria restores me on a daily basis. Different story, isn't it? That's the kind of dialogue we need to have about the future of the world. I'm sorry to say it, I've been a big fan of sustainability for a long time, but it bores people to death. Who wants to sustain a mess? Let's revitalize and restore. We've got a whole world full of restorable assets out there. Virtually everything we've been calling a problem is a restorable asset. Everything in the community that we've been thinking of as in the way of revitalization is an ingredient of revitalization. Now, for infrastructure, for instance, there's a word that normally bores most audiences, probably not this one, but you can restore infrastructure, renew infrastructure just for the reasons of safety, which is not a bad thing. But a lot of infrastructure is also historic. I took this picture of a bridge in Scotland when I was over there in 2003 that was just being restored, and took this picture again in 2008 when I was back over there. They didn't just restore safety or functionality, they were restoring heritage here. That bridge is almost 150 years old. So there's a lot of overlap amongst these agendas. And it's not just a matter of demolition or restoration, it's also reuse. In Chattanooga, they had this horse-drawn carriage bridge from the 1800s, and they were about to demolish it because there's no way to make it strong enough for cars. And somebody had the bright idea, well, what about pedestrians and bicycles? It's plenty strong enough for that. Now it's one of the major community assets. Chattanooga has a portion of the city on both sides of the river. This connects them beautifully. And they actually hold community parties on here at sunset on a regular basis. They used to have the world's longest pedestrian bridge. Poughkeepsie took a look at that Chattanooga bridge and said, we can do better. We've got a rail bridge over the Hudson River, and that's now the world's largest pedestrian bridge. Just a matter of reuse. It cost almost nothing to convert that to a pedestrian bridge, but it's a huge amenity. We can ignore our infrastructure problems at our peril. Macau was growing beautifully for a long time there, and all of a sudden people realized the infrastructure was falling apart, and all the investors started pulling out. And Macau went into decline. Not because the casinos, there's anything wrong with the casinos, but it was the infrastructure that scared people. Infrastructure is at the heart of a tremendous number of community revitalization efforts. So that's, it's really key to connectivity, you could say. If a community isn't properly connected and if things don't flow properly, you're probably not going to have a revitalized community. So speaking of connectivity, that's the next big thing. Number two is it's not enough just to base our economic growth on renewing our assets. We've got to connect them properly because that's where the efficiencies and the synergies come from. If you want to get a bigger bang for your buck, restore the natural environment, the built environment, the socioeconomic environment together. The trouble is we're set up to do everything in silos. Those are the infrastructure people, those are the brownfield people, those are heritage people, they're the ones that take care of the frogs. Community is a complex living system. You can't treat it like an automobile engine where this guy specializes in valves and that guy does the crankshaft. Philadelphia gets it. Just in the last year, they announced a huge green initiative that unites their goals to green the city, make it more livable, restore their watershed, renew their water infrastructure and their sewer infrastructure, and restore the river, all in one fell swoop. It's a totally integrated green water initiative that addresses the natural side and the built side. Anybody recognize this old quarry? Yeah, there we go. Butchart Gardens on Vancouver Island, which is one of the major economic engines of Vancouver Island, formerly just a dead quarry. Great example of restoration and reuse. Anybody recognize that?
That's the biosphere.
Close. That's the Eden Project in Cornwall, over in England. This too, just an ugly old scar on the earth. Somebody got the bright idea of turning it into a tourist attraction and an environmental education facility. It's now the largest employer in all of Cornwall. So the fact is that everything's connected. There's no such thing as, a social problem that's not related to the environment, or environmental problem that's not related to society or the economy. They're all connected. So when you affect one, you're affecting them all. When they restored that old mine, they restored the economy, they restored the communities, the society, the crime went down. There's these ripple effects through everything. And in California, you probably heard about the wildfires they seem to have there every summer. What they discovered was that the reason they're having such bad wildfires is because the hills are covered in invasive species that were brought in by the Anglos from the east and the Spaniards from the south, and all the overgrazing that went on replaced the native vegetation, which normally stayed green during the summer, with exotic vegetation that turned brown in the summer and burned. So by restoring native species to their hills, they can cut down on the catastrophic effects of all these wildfires. I love that picture of the Los Angelino escaping the wildfire on his Segway while texting. They've got their own style out there. Now, one of my favorite companies is in Maryland called Biohabitats, run by a great guy named Keith Bowers. And they're in the stream restoration, wetland restoration business. But are they really? Maybe they're in the property enhancement, real estate value enhancement business. Let's take a look. Here's a stream that they were contracted to restore about a 2-mile section of, probably about 10 years ago. And it had been channelized in the great tradition of civil engineering, wrapped in concrete. And here's what it looked like about a year into it after they had restored what they call the fluvial dynamics. And that's what it looked like about 2 years later after they had restored the native vegetation. And this is what it looks like today. And that's about as close to doing magic for a living as I know of. But it's not just there for the fish or the birds or the butterflies. Imagine that you've got an apartment building right next to that, or a big office building. Which one of these creeks is going to add more to what you can charge per square meter for your building? That one? Or that one? If I were to live there, or even just to work there, I'd love to be able to walk along this beautiful restored stream on my lunch breaks or in the evening. So you're talking about enhancing the value of property. And can anybody here name a stream, a river in London? Okay, name another one. Yeah, don't worry about it. I asked that question in London 2 years ago, and everybody looked at me cross-eyed. In actual fact, they've got 14 rivers and streams in London. 13 of them are buried. So they've launched a 50-year initiative to daylight. That's what they call it, daylighting the streams and rivers, because they've realized that water is the magic revitalizer. If you've got water, you can revitalize. If you've got a lot of water and you're not revitalizing, somebody isn't trying very hard. So they figure if they get all these streams flowing throughout a lot of distressed neighborhoods, they can use that to economically and socially revitalize a lot of distressed neighborhoods. Does that kind of approach really work? Well, go over to Seoul. They've got the Cheongashon stream there, which is an ancient stream. If you read old Korean fairy tales, you'll see it referred to in their lore. And this young guy got the idea because, well, 55 years ago, they buried the stream, covered it up with this ugly superhighway. Superhighway ran right through the heart of Seoul, separated a lot of vibrant neighborhoods, almost killed them because people could no longer just walk over and shop with each other and visit each other. And real estate values went down because nobody wanted to be right next to all this dirty, noisy, polluting activity. And so this young guy got this idea, well, how about if we bring back the stream? Because, boy, if we had this greenway running through the heart of Seoul with flowing water and pedestrian access, and if we could reconnect the neighborhoods, everything would come back to life. And so that's what they decided to do. And in the process, they were restoring heritage, they were cleaning up brownfields, they were revitalizing just about every aspect of the place. And in order to make sure that removing the highway didn't cause traffic problems, before they removed it, they greatly increased mass transit. So no problems occurred when they pulled the highway out. And it's not just the people that have benefited. You know, the wildlife is coming back, something they haven't seen in over 50 years in downtown Seoul. So it's a tremendous success now. Now, the young guy who suggested this project was a political candidate. He was running for mayor. And it was his promise to restore the Cheonggyecheon that got him elected mayor of Seoul. It was his success at doing it that got him elected president of South Korea. So, you know, brownfields. You got a lot of brownfields in the area, and about $700 million worth of property value lying fallow because of real or perceived contamination just here in Toronto. And let me just, for those of you who aren't familiar with it, I'll just give you a couple of quick before and afters. There's an old, one of the original brownfields projects, an after shot. There's a before. And I guess they probably renamed that place by now, haven't they? And here's a before and an after. Now, those of you who have any sense of aesthetic sensibilities whatsoever might be looking at that and saying, hold on, am I supposed to be impressed? Yeah, what's so great about another McDonald's or Home Depot sitting in a sea of asphalt? Well, it's not what's on that site that's wonderful. It's where that Home Depot and McDonald's are. Because they're on that redeveloped brownfield site, they're not out in the green fields. The US EPA has documented hard numbers that every acre of urban brownfields that are remediated and redeveloped save 4.5 acres of greenfields. So you're not just talking about an economic development strategy here, you're also talking about a conservation strategy. And the ultimate, the leading edge of that, is green redevelopment, not just redeveloping a place and bringing it back to life, but doing so in using green technologies and green designs so that what's recreated on that spot is now healthier and more sustainable than what was there before. For instance, what they're doing here on Treasure Island, just in the Bay, San Francisco Bay, creating a whole new island out of a polluted military base, big green development. And the integration just doesn't happen in the physical assets. For instance, the mayor of Medellin, Colombia, had a tremendous crime problem. You might have heard about it. And he decided that he would integrate the renewal of the natural and the built environment with the reduction of crime. You know, integrate the whole social thing in with this physical stuff. And so he came up with a plan whereby he rewarded neighborhoods that reduced crime with redevelopment and restoration projects. He'd renovate their local park or restore a historic building or whatever as a reward anytime the neighborhood reduced their crime. And look at the numbers. 90% reduction in murder in 6 years. You know, when was the last time you heard those kinds of numbers? So you can integrate this stuff on any number of levels. Next big thing, number 3, cooperation. Competing has basically been almost our sole model now for so long. All you hear about is, you know, competition is the essence of moving forward and progress, you know. And, you know, it's true, you know, that you can develop your strengths and discover your weaknesses through competition, but you can do it through cooperation too. As a matter of fact, cooperating is being discovered now by scientists to be the primary way in which natural evolution takes place. All we've heard about up till now is, you know, the nature red and tooth and claw type of approach where everybody's trying to kill each other and only the fit survive. But in actual fact, the research is starting to show that cooperation is a much more profound and a basic factor within nature than competition is. But it's not one or the other. The two go together kind of like yin and yang. They kind of balance each other. So what's happening now is this whole trend is towards more cooperative community renewal rather than the old developer versus a citizen approach. Now, like I said, I've been doing this full-time for over a decade now, and I've seen many cities that have thrown millions, sometimes billions of dollars at redevelopment and still not achieved what they wanted, which is revitalization. And they kind of had a habit of asking me why that was. And it's the trouble with representing yourself as an expert. So I decided to go on this whole quest for a holy grail, a reliable recipe for revitalization. You know, if billions of dollars can't make it happen, you know, what does make it happen? And what is it, anyway? I mean, you know, remediation of brownfields is, you know, that's a hard discipline. You've got scientists and engineers involved. You know, restoring a river, you know, restoring a historic building, you got architects and engineers involved. They're all rigorous sciences. But then you get to revitalization, and what happens? All the rigor just goes out the window. You know, the cartoon there represents what happens in most revitalization sessions. You know, people, they'll get a bunch of architects and planners and engineers and economists together in the rooms. They come up with a revitalization plan. And somewhere along that process, when it comes to the point of saying, here's where we'll be revitalized, there's this gap there where they basically said, you know, we hope, you know, something's got to happen, but we don't exactly what, because we don't know how to make revitalization happen. It's more of an emergent quality of a complex system, and it can't be engineered or predicted. So that became the basis of my 2008 book, reWealth. And in addition to those three principles that we've already hit on here, you know, asset renewal, connected asset renewal, and cooperative connected asset renewal, I found in the research for that 2008 book that there are three practices that always seem to be present in communities that revitalize successfully, or that always seem to be missing in communities that fail to revitalize. First was a shared vision. That sounds like kind of a touchy-feely thing, you know, nice to have, but not really all that important. But consider that, you know, a project is simply how you implement a plan. But a plan is how you implement a strategy. And a strategy is how you implement a vision. So if you don't have a vision, your projects and plans really don't have any kind of firm foundation to be based on. It might be the world's best plan. You might have spent $1 million planning. But if it wasn't based on a shared vision of where the community wants to go, it might just be a really good, expensive way of getting somewhere you don't want to be. The second of those common practices amongst the revitalization successes is creating a renewal culture. In other words, getting out of the way. There are so many communities that invite redevelopers to come in and say, oh yeah, we really want you to help revitalize our waterfront. But then instead of rolling out the red carpet for them, they roll out the red tape. And it turns out that all of their building codes and zoning and development incentives and regulations are all based on sprawl. And the poor guy's sitting there on borrowed money, the interest is piling up. He spends the next 2 years getting exceptions to this zoning, exceptions to that building code, you know, and finding all the incentives are geared towards development rather than redevelopment. You know, the city's just totally out of the way. You've got to build a renewal culture at every level to make your place the most profitable and efficient place to work. Otherwise, they're just going to go somewhere else, maybe out in the green fields. The last of those three practices that always showed up in the revitalization successes was partnering. And especially in hard economic times, knowing how to be a good partner, whether it's a public-public, public-private, or private-private partnership, is absolutely essential. Let me give you two quick examples of how that worked in Washington, D.C., where I'm from. The Oyster Bilingual School was the only bilingual school in the District of Columbia. And in 1995, the school was falling apart, but the school didn't have any money and the city was broke. And they figured they were going to have to close it down. Now, the school is in a wonderful neighborhood. You've got all kinds of beautiful houses there. There's the Panamanian Embassy. You got the National Zoo is just a couple blocks up the road. You got a metro stop. You got everything you could possibly want. And as a result of this being such a great neighborhood, the real estate developers were hunting around looking for opportunities to do some multifamily stuff, because that was the one thing the neighborhood didn't have much of, was multifamily housing. And this one developer, Elcor, out of Maryland, was especially looking really hard, just desperately trying to find some property to do a multifamily housing project on. Just couldn't do it. But there was a nonprofit called the 21st Century School Fund that was working with the Oyster School, trying to save them, and their whole approach is partnering. And so they were aware of Oyster School's problems, and they were aware of Elcor's search for a project, and they're also aware that the Oyster School had a section of land they weren't using. So they decided to put together a partnership. And in 2001, the Oyster Schools got themselves an $11 million brand new gymnasium. All of their classrooms are remodeled to make them ideal for multilingual education. That's what the Oyster School looked like in 2001 after the renovation, and it was all because of this building here, where Elcor put up their multifamily building. And basically the partnership was, yeah, if you'll put up if you'll renovate our entire school, we'll let you put the building there. How'd that work out for Elcor? They put $26 million into it, yeah, 26, and sold it 2 years later for $56 million. So that's how a partnership is supposed to work. The key there is that everybody took risk, especially Elcor. You know, if there's no risk being taken on the private side, then it's not a partnership. It's just a sweetheart deal. Another project in Washington is Union Station. Anybody ever been there? I'm talking about ours, not yours. So back in 1981, Union Station was falling apart. It was all closed up, the roof was leaking. The only reason they hadn't demolished it was because nobody had the money to demolish it. The city again was broke. And it was an absolute disgrace. The entire neighborhood around it was a disgrace, and this is 2 blocks from the US Capitol. So all these foreign visitors were in town walking through this decrepit neighborhood. You know, it was a real eyesore. They figured it would take about $160 million to restore it. And that's exactly what they did over a 3-year period in the mid-80s. That's what it looks like today. Absolutely gorgeous building. And the entire neighborhood around it has been revitalized. Thanks to Union Station's revitalization, it just had this ripple effect where every other building in the neighborhood has been restored and reused. There is not a single vacant building anywhere. Total cost to taxpayers for that restoration, $0. How'd they do it? Public-private partnership with Jones Lang LaSalle. Jones Lang LaSalle got a 99-year lease in the interior operations. They got all the restaurants and retail. They're coming out and making out like bandits on that. And the city got themselves a brand new restored building. But even partnering is not enough. There's one more factor here. And that's timing. If you can't engineer revitalization, then how do you know it's the right time to make all this happen? And how do you know when to stop doing all this stuff? And the key to that is not to stop doing it. You just need to keep on doing this stuff until revitalization kicks in. You can't predict it. You can't say it's going to happen within your administration if you're an elected official. You've got no idea when revitalization is going to kick in. It's always going to have that magical aspect to it. So all you can do is put together an ongoing program. But ongoing programs are really hard to do at the community level, thanks in part to democracy. If it started on the political side, it'll probably be killed when there's a change of administration. So that doesn't work, and there usually aren't any government agencies that are capable of putting together a holistic ongoing revitalization program because everybody's in silos. There's 6 problems today, especially, just at the end of this last 10 years of social and economic change, especially within the last 5 years. 6 problems especially are crippling communities' ability to revitalize themselves today. One of them, and some of these have been around forever, one of them is institutional inertia and risk aversion. Even when somebody has a great idea, it's almost impossible for them to get it implemented. Another is the public's growing concern over corporate influence over public policy. You know, people are feeling like they're not in control of their cities anymore. You know, a big box store comes to town and just rams its way in. There's a feeling of decline of democracy, real democracy, especially at the higher levels, you know, provincial and federal and state levels. Not so much at the local levels. Rising economic inequity and the resulting social disharmonies, making it harder for communities to work together. It's feeling more like us versus them. Increasing political dysfunction, especially south of the border. South of your border, not mine. The level of political disharmony dysfunction is just incredible right now. So relying on the public side is a chancy proposition, but people are also saying they don't trust the private side. And then on top of all that, you've got an ongoing recession, so there's not as much credit or money available for all this stuff to happen. As a result of that, there's been a rise of what I'm calling citizen-led renewal. CLR, the R can stand for almost anything. Citizen-led regeneration, citizen-led revitalization, whatever you want to call it. It's the citizen-led that's important. And the key here is that the citizens have got a space that nobody else owns. And they can run all themselves, and it's the space that the communities need more than anything else. Because right now, you've got 5 Ps representing the spaces out there. You got the planning space, totally controlled by the planners and everybody they work with. You got the project space, totally controlled by the contractors and developers and everybody they work with. You got the policy space run by the politicians. And in none of those spaces does the public have any real traction or ownership. You know, every once in a while, you know, one of those groups will engage the public when it's politically expedient or yeah, handy to do so. But the public doesn't really have any ownership there. Traditionally, the public gets involved in polls and protests. Voting is a form of polling. So that's their P. And that doesn't work very well. Feels good occasionally, but it doesn't actually accomplish much. But there's a 5th P, and that's programs. Anybody know the difference between a project and a program? The project, yeah.
Comes to an end.
Sorry?
Like comes to an end.
Yeah, that's one of the primary things, yeah, exactly. According to the Project Management Institute, which is a huge organization, about 500,000 project managers, their official definition is a program is a group of projects that are managed in such a way as to derive controls and benefits that are not derivable from an individual project. In other words, the whole is more than the sum of the parts. You don't see this applied very much. People don't realize that they could get so much more out of their community revitalization efforts if they brought them together into a program instead of just doing them as individual projects. You can't get any momentum going. And that's the key here. You need a flywheel effect. You need an ongoing project to catch the momentum from each successful program, to catch the momentum from each successful project, because that builds confidence. And confidence is the primary thing a community needs if it's going to revitalize. Confidence is what attracts investors. Confidence in the future is what attracts residents and employers. Investors don't care what condition your community's in. It could be the ugliest community on the face of the earth, but if they've got confidence that the community's hit bottom and it's all up from here, they want a piece. That's where buy low, sell high comes from. So what citizens have is program space. The citizens are the only ones who don't get voted out of office every 4 years or so. Citizens are the only ones who want their community treated as a whole, not in silos. And the citizens are the only ones who want everybody engaged in it. So they own the program space. They own the flywheel, the ongoing program. But how do they do that? Well, let me give you a quick example here. I'll talk faster. Anybody here heard of the High Line project in New York City?
Yes.
Okay. Have you been there? Yep. Wonderful place, right? Yeah. It's just, I walk it at least twice every time I go there. Just incredible. High Line basically, oops, let me go back there. New York City and southern Manhattan used to have a ground level train. And that obviously didn't work out too well, getting in the way of people or on top of people. So they decided to raise it. They turned it into an elevated train. And that's what it looked like when it was in its prime. And what happened was the train company went out of business, the High Line was abandoned, and for years, decades, it just sat there, totally unused, this rusting eyesore. And one day, these two guys, not her or him, decided to climb up to the High Line, see what it looked like from up there, and discovered that the High Line had attracted all this dirt from the wind, I guess, and had naturally reseeded, and it was absolutely beautiful. All this natural vegetation up there. They looked around and said, wow, what a view. What a great park this would make. And that was the beginning of the idea of turning the High Line into a linear park. They did all the usual stuff, public engagement meetings, emails, phone calls, all the old style of community organizing, and got it to the point where people got on board, and they got funding from the city, and they started turning it into the High Line Park, which is absolutely phenomenal. It goes on for about 30 blocks. And is that's the end of it, or the beginning, depending on which way you're walking. And what's happening now is that it was so successful, they've actually done 2 sections of it now. There's a 3rd phase about to start that goes all the way down to the river. And the whole area around the High Line is getting revitalized. You know, everybody wants to live or work next to the High Line so they can enjoy it at a moment's notice. So real estate values have skyrocketed. There's more new development going on along the High Line than has happened in half a century. People just can't believe how much money is just flowing into the area just because people turned an old railway into a park. The key, what they did here, was they ignored the institutions. It was citizen-led renewal. They decided, let's just get this going. Who cares who doesn't come aboard? Let's go with whoever we've got aboard and get this to a point of critical mass. And you might recognize some of those faces there. Once they got it to that point where it was obvious that the public was behind this and it was a great idea and it was going to work, all the risk-averse elements came aboard. So what citizen-led renewal does is reverse the risk. It makes it very difficult to say no to it because they've taken it to the point where there's more risk in saying no to something that's reached this level of public support than there was in the beginning. So they didn't even bother asking him in the beginning. I'm going to skip this slide. It takes too long to read. It's basically talking about how people have lost faith in leaders. So my next book, Recivilizing, coming out in January, is talking about the rise of the citizen-led regeneration. But there's something that's been accelerating it, because citizens have been jumping into the breach for centuries, you know, as long as governments weren't doing what they were supposed to do. Why is it different now? What's happened is there's an accelerant been poured on this fast-growing trend, and that's crowd technologies. You've all heard of well, everybody here has heard of the High Line now, but I'll bet nobody here has heard of the Low Line, right? Except the steering committee members. That's the next big thing, number 4, is the combination of citizen-led renewal and crowd technologies. Now, the Low Line, a couple of architects discovered this huge abandoned trolley station, underground trolley station. And it's called the Delancey Underground, and they call it Low Line just to kind of pick up on some of the High Line energy. And they didn't go through 4 years of citizen engagement and emailing and phone calling. They put a project on Kickstarter.com. They said, we need $100,000 to come up with detailed architectural drawings so that we can take to the city and the rail company and everybody else who needs to back this project. And they, 45 days later, had $155,000 and over 3,000 backers. So in 45 days, they got 3,000 enthusiastic backers who had put money behind this and reached a level in 45 days that it took the High Line people 4 years to achieve. That's the power of crowd technologies. And everywhere you look now, all people are talking about is the Low Line all around Manhattan, showing up in art galleries. It's just the cool thing right now. Now, up till now, everybody's been saying that social media was going to save the world. And it's done a good job of connecting us, but all social media does is connect us. You can't really do much with social media. What crowd technologies do is enable us to cooperate and make real things happen. You know, crowd mapping is an application that basically uses everyone's eyes and smartphones and enables you to put together maps almost overnight for like hurricane damage and, you know, these major events were all crowd mapped by citizens so that people could discover where to go for help or what areas to avoid. Crowdsourcing is a design process. It's a competitive design process. The Pentagon created a brand new military vehicle for less than $1 million in just a few months using crowdsourcing. That normally would have taken about $1 billion in 10 years to achieve. They've got crowdsourcing sites for all kinds of purposes right now. Here's one that's trying to figure out how to revitalize cities. And crowdsourcing is basically a design process that, you know, brings in huge amounts of input and then distills it down to the best ideas. Technologically, here's some of the good ideas that came out of that one. Now, friends of mine in New Orleans decided to use crowdfunding to launch a community farm. They had an ugly old abandoned lot. They wanted a community farm there. They needed $4,000. They put a project on Kickstarter.com, and 45 days later, here it is, 12 days to go, they had 72 backers and $3,400. And here they are with 7 days to go, they passed their goal. Kickstarter's all or nothing. If you don't hit your goal, you don't get any of the money. And that community garden is now a huge community asset down there in New Orleans. Citizen-led community farms are actually becoming major economic forces all around the world. This company, spacehive.com, is a crowdfunding site in the UK. They're combining government and foundation funding with crowdfunding. So when a project has got most of what it needs from the public sector or foundations, they use crowdfunding to fill in the gap to make sure the project gets done. So here you've got an ecological restoration of a pond, you've got renovation of a community center, you've got revitalization of industrial docks. So they're taking on really big stuff there. Documentaries. And here's a revitalization-oriented documentary that was funded on Kickstarter. As a matter of fact, over 20% of the movies at the Sundance Film Festival this year were funded on Kickstarter. And another 15% were on Indiegogo, another crowdfunding site. So crowdfunding is rapidly going mainstream. Scientific researchers are starting to use crowdfunding to get the money they need for their research. And there are hundreds of crowdfunding sites out there, probably thousands right now. What the citizen-led renewal plus crowdfunding, or crowd technology does, is enable the citizens to bypass the institutions that would normally get in their way. Either the ones that would fight them because they have some vested interests, or the ones that would just be in the way because of inertia. Now, what happens then is the good institutions will then support the citizen-led projects once they're well underway. You know, it's like I said, it's reversing the risk. You know, when followers lead, leaders follow. And you know, most institutions aren't bad. You know, they've just locked themselves into silos, and those silos eventually suffocate them. You know, crowdsourcing is actually being used now by some institutions to figure out strategies so they can deal with a world of citizen-led activity. But institutions don't have a monopoly on stupidity. You know, we individuals are quite capable of it ourselves. You know, institutions also don't have a monopoly on uncivilized behavior. You know, if you've ever been to a town hall meeting, any kind of community meeting where trying to figure out what to do with the community, you know there are always some people there who loudmouths or disruptive people who enjoy putting people at each other's throats. I call them slinkies, you know, because like slinkies, they're not good for much, but they sure put a smile on your face when you push them down the stairs. Here's a possible slinky here. $16 million river restoration project, 30 years in the making, being held up by one landowner. Now, is he a slinky? Or was that just a bad public engagement process? Now, citizen-led renewal is no substitute for the big stuff. You know, stuff like this. You know, you're not going to do that on a citizen-led scale yet. Once the tools are in place, maybe. You know, there's always going to be a big role for government because some problems are national in level. They simply can't be addressed at the local level. But public money, when spent, should try to catalyze private money. The US EPA knows that. You know, here they announced almost $70 million that specifically said it was meant to clean up contaminated sites that would then attract private investment. Here's an example of one of them. $3 million cleanup grant. Won a promise from a private developer for a $100 million development. Now, crowd technologies aren't a substitute, you know, just like citizen-led renewal isn't a substitute for big government projects, neither are crowd technologies a substitute for private, large-scale private funding. You know, you're not going to do a $50 billion project like this Louisiana coastline restoration through crowdfunding yet. So crowd-powered citizen-led renewal can be seen as either a threat or an opportunity. There might be some in some institutions that are absolutely terrified by what I'm talking about right now. But in actual fact, it's a great opportunity for the institutions that are able to see this as an opportunity. Because if you own a lot of real estate and the area around the real estate gets revitalized, your real estate values are going up. They might go up more as a result of overall community revitalization than as a result of the expensive improvements you've made in that real estate. And it's also an excellent goodwill strategy. Quality of life applies to commercial development every bit as much as it applies to residential development. Great example, a lot of these economic development freebies are really just tiebreakers. If you talk to the people who are moving a big company into a town, you ask them why they did it, they'll talk about schools, they'll talk about what a great place it'll be to raise their kids, they'll talk about quality of life. Chattanooga got $1 billion Volkswagen plant recently. You know what was the tiebreaker? What got the VW to put $1 billion onto a cleaned up Chattanooga waterfront brownfield? It was because Chattanooga had revitalized their downtown waterfront and they created a river trail, but it didn't quite go down to the brownfield site where Volkswagen wanted to put their plant. They said, if you'll continue that trail along the river down to our plant so our employees can walk along the river up to the downtown to go to the restaurants, we'll put our plant in your city. You know how much that little trail cost? Almost nothing. Just a little bit of connectivity and cooperation went a long way. So, recivilizing, you could say, is connected, cooperative, ongoing renewal of our built natural and social environments and economic environments. So recivilizing can be seen as kind of your strategy for harnessing all four of those next big things: regeneration, connecting, cooperating, and citizen-led renewal. Tools are necessary, though. Citizens can't organize all this on their own. They really need to get that ongoing program together, and the tools need to be simple. They've got to be things that people can dive into for a few minutes and just dive right out of. People aren't interested in spending hours on a site doing anything these days. So that's what we're doing at reCitizen. We're creating the world's first integrated suite of crowd mapping, crowdsourcing, crowdfunding applications specifically for creating ongoing citizen-led regeneration programs, and we're going to be providing those tools to communities free of charge. So let me close with a benediction from the Bishop of London. We talk of sustainable development and sustainable economies, but it's time to move on to restorative developments and restorative economies. Thank you very much.